Welcome, everybody. I will put the meeting notes link into the chat. Hello, and welcome to our first EMEA version of Tag Security. We will give it a couple of minutes still to let people join. And in the meantime, if people would be so kind as to add their names in the attendance list of the document which is on the meeting invite and in the chat channel as well. We are also streaming on YouTube. And the video will be uploaded when it's done as well. Okie dokie. Well, welcome 1,000 times. Welcome. This is a reminder, this meeting is being recorded and streamed to YouTube and will be posted shortly afterwards. Your participation in these meetings is an agreement to abide by the Cloud Native Security Code of Conduct, which can be found in the repo. Normally we'd ask for somebody to scribe, but I realized we're there are some old timers here as well. If anyone would like to scribe, please do feel welcome. Otherwise, I'm happy to run cover on that for this week. Primary content discussed is recorded in the written notes and may be referred to later. For existing members and working group reps, please remember when filling in the attendance to include your organization or company along with the working group you're interested with and any update you may have. As this is the first incarnation of our, as I say, of the EMEA group, any questions, comments, feedback, very much welcome. Anything from the time that we're running at or any of the content of the meeting. The goal today will be to run through one of our issues and have a working group session around some lightweight threat modeling. But before that, we like to introduce new members. So anybody who's joining for the first time, if you'd like to just introduce yourself and give a brief overview or any interest that you have with the group.
I'll jump in. Rowan Baker, I'm head of security at Control Plane. I was part of the group for a brief period in 2020, but unfortunately had to pull out because of COVID and other associated family engagements. So trying to get back into the swing of things, and the two areas that would be of interest to me are the cloud native security controls mapping and the security review projects as and when they come up. Take me a little bit of time to find my feet, but I'd like to contribute to both of those ultimately.
Hi everybody, I'll go next. I'm Francesco, the security engineering manager for Control Plane. I actually report to Rowan, and first time for me. I have just, I'm here just observing, and I have a personal interest in everything covered in these sessions. Thank you.
I'll jump into similar to Francesco, software engineer at Control Plane, first time joiner, so I'll mostly lurk from the shadow, trying to learn how it works, and I'm interested in the topic, obviously, and yeah, that's it.
I'll go next. Hi, I'm Rishit. I've been interested in a couple of projects, especially in Toto, which I've been exploring. I hope to find it.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, everybody. Welcome, of course, and thank you for your interest and contribution. Okay, do we have any updates anyone would like to give here?
Just as a, I guess, nice overlap there between new member intros and basically a plug for the cloud native security controls, because it was mentioned by Rowan. I don't have any updates to provide at this time. I don't know if John's on currently, but for those interested in cloud native security controls and kind of our current roadmap that we're getting in place for working with OSCAL and kind of doing some of the mappings across there. If you are interested, reach out. I can find a better way to make some information more readily available, and we can get those. We have a bi-weekly sync that is kind of great for introductions and for those who are interested.
Super cool. Thank you very much. Anything from anybody else before we move on? Okay, I'll just whiz quickly through some of the open issues because I realize with a more US time zone friendly meeting agenda, cadence rather, some of these may not be clear to us all, and these are all open for contribution. Anybody is welcome. I'll just share quickly what I have here so we can see the agenda list. Okay. So what we're looking at here is the issues most recently updated. Let's go from the bottom, just scan through them quickly. These are essentially the active pieces of work. Software supply chain best practice document control breakdown example. So somebody has contributed a real world use case for the software supply chain best practices this group generated last year, and mapped them to internal controls that they use in their organization. I can share the link. Oh dear. Okay, let's share the link here instead. So this is, I wonder where that is. Yes, that is a bucket of gray as well. Never mind this time. So I'll just run through these briefly then anyway. I guess there'll be some slight, well, in fact, you can follow them from the link, but the software supply chain best practice document control breakdown example, this issue is a real world use case and really quite interesting. There may be something that we decide to build on top of that. If anyone would like to jump in on any of these, please just do interrupt me. There is a new use case presentation from Trousseau. I don't know if somebody with better French can correct me there. That is 963. So what's happening with this is there's a sandbox inclusion meeting that the technical oversight committee undertakes, and once that happens, projects are presented to us in this group for feedback. Sometimes we will then look to perform a security assessment, and essentially we look to advise the product or the project, sorry, in the most useful way that we can. So at some point, they will schedule a presentation for 45 minutes for one of either this meeting or the US centric or time zone friendly version. Then we have analysis of SSCP on Salsa. It's issue 960. And again, there is a useful mapping of, this is from Marina Moore, who is one of our tech leads. And she started, again, to map essentially tooling to the supply chain security tools mapped in against those. That would be really helpful, Brandon. Yes, if it'll work for you, please. That would add a little bit of color. I'm not sure if you need permission to do that. Wonderful, thank you. Thank you very much. And then moving on to the next one. If you could, yes, fantastic. Thank you very much. Then we have cloud native security controls mapping to Nist. Well ahead of me. Might just follow your screen. Again, that is Marina's, that is a similar update. So those last two issues are essentially tied together by Marina's update there. Then we have lightweight threat modeling guidance for CNCF projects. This is the issue we will be looking at later today for the last half of the meeting. What we'll go through, we have a couple of suggestions here at the top from Mozilla's rapid risk assessment and Shostak's STRIDE methodology that we'll go through some background on. And then there's a number of other frameworks people have suggested. So we'll take a quick look at these, do a compare and contrast, and see which kind of take our fancy and which makes sense to start investigating and comparing. Interestingly, the penultimate comment is from the Trail of Bits audit of Kubernetes itself. So that's a very sort of meta CNCF posting there. And then at the bottom, we've also got some useful templates from KubeArmor, which are looking to build out a generic Kubernetes threat modeling tool. So we'll dig more into that issue later. Perhaps whizzing through some of these a bit more quickly. Cloud Native Security White Paper V2. There is a lot on here. Ultimately, that is not particularly useful to us. It's just some formatting bits. Adding content on maintaining up-to-date dependencies. Some of these are Stalebot, actually. I saw these come through recently. In fact, a number of these are, so we'll try and get through those quickly. Interestingly, the top one here, collaboration with tag observability. This was suggested a couple of days ago. So there's a gentleman is working on essentially using some kind of data analytics across the land. Oh, sorry, go on.
Me.
Hello, Matt's here. Wonderful. Please, by all means, I'd love you to introduce this.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Matt. I'm one of the co-chairs for Tag Observability, which we launched a few years ago, two and change ago. And last fall, in one of the TOC meetings, there was a bit of a kerfuffle of sorts around end user community radars put out, and how, how it was difficult to visualize the landscape itself, what's a vendor, what's a project, etc. And so this little kernel of a need that most tags have to quantify the landscape, who are the players, what are they up to, who's contributing to what, what categories are things and how do they fit together, all of that. And so we started kind of thinking about how could we solve the problem generally. And then this idea kind of grew to make a graph. And, then we started to think, well, what kind of questions could the graph answer? And sort of top of mind for me is that very first bullet point. What's all running based on artifacts? in my server, what packages are brought in, what are the dependency chains, what CVEs exist, what does Nist say, all of that. How is that changing over time, right? We need a data model for that, or perhaps a data model for IT decision makers. As I was in that role, myself at times, saying, hey, we want to use these 2 or 3 projects. Who are all the humans that contributed to that? Who paid them to do so? Who funded those companies, and what else did they fund? From the clusters, to do friend of a friend of a friend, or to look at overall trends. Things start looking like fraud analysis, or all manner of other graph data science applications that are quite that there's a bit of history with, right? So we want to make a data model that has basically everything that goes into the landscape today, plus whatever we'd like to bring in, augmented with Git base and or other Git caching mechanisms, and finally using GraphQL as a strongly typed interface definition language in concert with Neo4j or dgraph or Redis Graph, and anything that really does OpenCipher as its query language to provide that. All right, and so the implications for secure supply chain and SBOM are, I think, evident. And as we add other things to our tool sets, such as continuous profiling metrics or any number of other things that could be linked in that have security capabilities for security tooling. I wanted to make this available. And then lastly, the concrete ask in the near term of this issue is, if you scroll down a bit, when it comes to packages, here's sort of the little directory tree there, rather. There. This is sort of we've been working on a subgraph module design for how we'll make a supergraph, if you will, made up of a whole bunch of subgraphs such that they can be tested and iterated on independently. We can do things in CI. We can ensure that the subgraphs compose nicely, and there's some there's a primordial design kind of there for that. That's I'm actually in the middle of implementing this week. But when it comes to package manifests and package metadata, we'd like to engage with this tag, the domain experts on what that data model should be, right? And what should be common across all packages. We have sort of a the ability to have types extend other types using GraphQL's interfaces and union types, right? So as we create this object model, and there's some pretty pictures on in the repo, both for the threats, which I've got there, the things coming out of Nist, like the CVE databases and whatnot, but I'm sure there are others, other sources of vulnerability enumerations or assessments or other things that on a regular cadence we would want to bring in and make available for visualizations, either using game tech, for if you're playing around with 3D, or using WASM, or WebAssembly in the browser, or using any number of other sort of graph visualization techniques to bring solutions to bear. So that big amorphous description is the project itself, which is about ready to start opening the doors to contribution. We're doing the final bits to get governance in place and good practices as recommended by tag contributor strategy and some others that we've been taking feedback from. But the first other tag I wanted to reach out to, given the priority and the importance of SBOM to cloud native systems, was to surface it here.
Awesome. It's a really fantastic initiative. I know this crosses over a lot into even some of the admission control techniques that we've seen suggested for querying composition, as you say, for SBOM. A personal interest of mine is also beneficial ownership, and the nature of, first of all, whether it's ethical, and second of all, whether it's necessary. And I think the answer to those is no and yes, respectively, to unmask contributors and detect collusion and identify sock puppet accounts. And these things become very difficult. Without this level of data visualization, almost impossible. So I'm super excited for that.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's also, to your point about is it ethical or not, to make correlations or to identify communities of contributors, etc. Your point is well put. Similarly, it's also challenging to celebrate successes or to identify opportunities for collaboration between similar projects or places where communities have a bunch of shared friends that don't actually know each other professionally, right? And all sorts of other things are more challenging on the positive side as well. So I think some of the, how this is to be used and all of that in its implementations certainly it gives one pause and is fodder for future discussions. But at the moment, I think the focus is on really providing a data model that can address this and many, many other sorts of interesting personas and scenarios. For example, if you're in the business of identifying projects that might need more funding or future contribution because the number of maintainers has been dwindling over time or is consolidated to one corporate entity, right, where we want to have more diversity of maintainership. Or if you wanted to look at trends in investment in the community, there's the ecosystem at large is about 30 trillion in market cap with 29.6 or so billion in investment that's flowed in, right? So what are trends in that? And so there's all manner of scenarios beyond security as well that motivate it. So in order to make progress in the here and now, while maybe deferring some of the more ethical quandaries, I'm just focusing on a data model that, in terms of big O, so to speak, can satisfy the various concerns in a way that doesn't become rapidly inordinately expensive to run and maintain, or a query complexity because you're using SQL and a rectangular view on what is a system of graphs or a hypergraph technically. Yeah, I think that's been at least my approach so far, and I would welcome contribution collaboration. Right now the project has been largely me, myself, and I, but I think I'm to the point now where there's something that has some framing around it.
Awesome. And just to be clear, I think those the specific pointy end of that ethical stick is people who are necessarily cloaked or masked because of their maybe authoritarian overlords in some degree, or whatever it would be. I think this is a fantastic effort, and thank you very much for bringing it in. I think moving forwards with that, we would probably look to maybe stand up a working group session around it specifically, and just kind of lead through and see where the hive mind can take us. There is another suggestion from Rory, who is on the call as well. That is 881, guidance on container breakout vulnerabilities. Would you like to just take us through that one, please, Rory?
Sure, yeah. So essentially on this one, this is an idea that came up over previous discussion. We've had a lot of container breakouts this year, and having some sort of documentation around this. And I think that where we are at the moment is we've got an idea of what we want to go into it, but we're not sure of the venue where we want it to go. So that's kind of like next stages there. I think that's where this issue currently sits. And so the idea would just be to provide some general guidance illustrated by the example breakouts we've had, because we've had them at various different levels, Linux kernel level, at the kind of container cryo level, and various other ones. So sort of saying how breakouts might happen, and how generically you can mitigate them, and when different mitigations might be appropriate. So that's kind of like the goal for that, is to provide something just kind of a bit higher level than the kind of individual kind of exploit definitions. You get very good blogs kind of explaining each exploit, but that's not, like a kind of a policy or a specific statement. It's more kind of around a specific bug. So having something a bit better for kind of general use.
Awesome. Thank you. One of the ways that we sort of built collaborative, Brandon has suggested here that a long blog would be appropriate. One of the ways we've done kind of bigger white papers or smaller white papers or smaller blogs before is, again, just have a kind of working group session, divide the thing up into chunks, make sure that we've got a shared kind of intro and conclusion, and then kind of split those bits up between interested contributors. What do you think of that as a potential approach?
Yeah, I think we can. I think if that's if we can identify the blog as being that right place, just I guess in terms of creating the content, if we're doing blogs, then we're going to approach it differently than on a white paper. Blogs are, you can kind of fit the format, whereas with the white paper, it's going to be kind of people will be giving people more, here's the framework, here's how we're going to do each section. So I think once we've kind of had that decision on where we want to go, I think that we can then kind of like move forward, because then we can kind of say, right, this is the format we're looking for.
Cool. Okay, so maybe there's still a question about how, not how much content there could be. I think there's obviously a lot, but how much enthusiasm people have to contribute. Maybe if we just ask for contributors, if we have a sufficient number, maybe we can generate something of a few thousand words instead of a few hundred.
Sounds like a plan.
Cool. Okay, that is exciting. Thank you very much. And finally, we had, so the last one, 906, we had a pair of presentations from the confidential containers project. It's very interesting. It's based on a kind of modified Kata containers view, and Brandon has added a white paper label here. So what we're looking to do is expand the Cloud Native Security white paper, or the V2, to add some more information around confidential containers. I would say for any of these issues, probably I've left this too late to say, but there is a subscription button on the right-hand side. And if people are interested in contributing into that, as we just spoke about, the collaboration process for white papers is very collaborative, I suppose. And if you subscribe to the issue, then as this progresses either in this time zone or in the US, there is an opportunity to contribute in there. Also, going back, in the meeting notes document, if you scroll back to the document that you added your names into, thanks, Brandon, then you can see in history, where are we, on the 27th perhaps? Nope, sorry, on the 20th. Then this confidential containers project, the presentation is there. Also the week before, there are links to kind of see a little bit more about the presentation, and the actual presentation itself is linked somewhere. All of those previous meetings are also on YouTube. So if that's something of interest, or indeed if something from this group is of interest to a different time zone, that's the way we intend to be able to collaborate asynchronously. We should have sufficient meeting notes to get a high level, and then the recording on YouTube to dig in slightly further. Okay, and with that, unless anybody has anything else in this section, we will jump into a little bit of threat modeling. So I'll rely on you further, please, Brandon, if you don't mind, to pop that threat modeling issue. It's actually in
906.
Yes, it's in the meetup notes as well. Is it 906 903?
3. Okay.
So at this point, we've got half an hour to go through this issue and just to sort of formulate some ideas here. We've also got the document, and I'll contribute into the notes there. I guess just as an introduction, and please, at this point, anybody who wants to jump in at any stage, just unmute yourself and do so, raise your hand. It is a free-for-all. The goal here is to establish some consistency in the mechanism that we use to threat model and try and generate security properties for projects that are submitted to us. So as we saw already, we have the Trousseau, I hope that's the correct pronunciation, that KMS provider plugin that's been submitted. We would look to understand it quickly, to ask sensible questions of the maintainers, and then to perform some kind of lightweight stand-up of the application or the plugin, and then in some form of framework, generate some form of output. Now, I know that's very high level. The goal of threat modeling is to clearly identify what the risks to either the usage of a piece of software or the construction and composition are, and from there to recommend what security controls would make sense. The point of doing it that way, in my opinion, and again, this is very much my opinion and open to anyone else's, is when applying controls or recommending additions to that security framework, it makes sense to do so in as lightweight manner as possible. If a single control can solve multiple different threats, that is less maintenance burden on the individuals who are building the software or the operators that are using it at runtime, and it's more likely to make everybody happier while still maintaining the safety of the system. Of course, one control across multiple threats also means if the system is being developed or the project is being developed and new features are added, somebody needs to go back to make sure that the control still correlates to the original risk, because maybe the composition of the software has changed in such a way that that's no longer exactly the right control, so that there is a balance there. In order then to actually perform a threat model, and it's probably worth saying as well briefly from my perspective, threat modeling historically has been an application level concern. It's been something that we look at, how is the front end attached to the address book service, attached to the order service, attached to the, back in the day, the credit card service, hopefully not anymore, and looking at data flows and how those individual things are secured. At this point, the practice has become more widely established in infrastructure as well, which gives us a useful way to apply controls to a wider system. The goal of what we do here is kind of a combination of both. A lot of the software that we appraise that comes through tag security is actually security support software that transcends infrastructure and application. Some of it's not specifically security software. So things that we have currently underway are Flux, which is a GitOps operator. It's not a piece of security software, but it can be highly privileged. It also can deploy security software, so there are properties and side effects. Another one coming through is Cert Manager, which takes the Let's Encrypt Acme protocol and actually plugs into numerous other things as well. And actually, the security of our system is reliant upon the sanctity of that piece of software, not leaking private keys, for example. So that there's a whole range of things here. Probably the most important thing to remember about threat modeling is that there are no wrong answers. We can just make stuff up and then actually see if it sticks. And it's meant to be a diffuse and sort of thought-provoking process where everyone is welcome to sort of throw their hat into the ring. Would anybody like to sort of extend or challenge that based on their own experiences in the tag? Okay, that's either I've said too much or it's so wrong that no one's willing to challenge. All right, if we meander through this issue then slightly. So if we could just click through the links and maybe discuss them, please, Brandon. Yeah, starting with Mozilla's framework. So I know some people have experience with this framework specifically. One of the benefits of this, and probably we won't be able to do a sort of risk-benefit analysis till we get through to the end, but they really try and make it quick. 60 minutes maximum is the goal here. It's also high level. There is an interesting balance when starting a threat model, scoping it to exactly what's useful is a difficult process. That's partially because work expands to fill the time to some extent, but also when dealing with something as complex as distributed system security, rabbit holes exist everywhere. And if we say, well, let's secure a Kubernetes cluster, do we include the applications? Do we include the infrastructure that it sits in, like the cloud? Do we include the configuration of the nodes underneath? For a full threat model, absolutely. They're all integration points. They're all potential points of escalation or pivoting, but it takes a long time. And to deliver ultimately business value from these things, it's my view that scoping them is necessary. So Mozilla Framework here wants to stay at a high level in order to be useful, I think. Concise, easy, informative. Okay, let's have a so the kind of risk-based decisions it says it supports there. Is the security provided by the platform appropriate to host a specific classification of data? I would say that that's quite a deep question to answer. But let's have a quick look at the sample use scenario as well. Firefox accounts store user data. What happens if the data is disclosed to the world, or the service goes down, or the data is modified? So some of these things we'll look at in the next in the Shostak method, which is classifying spoofing, tampering, various different things. Another use case scenario: these events put us at financial risk. So what's the actual impact of this going wrong? Is there productivity affected, reputation? This we can broadly map to the CIA triad, perhaps, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And then what types of data and how sensitive is that data? And those things are more related to the data classifications that maybe are a preamble to a threat model. So there we go. We've got a kind of high level there. There's some interesting detail about how to run this meeting very quickly at the bottom, which I think is very useful for a group like this, where we have a limited amount of time and collaborative time to achieve things. And then some impact scores at the bottom. So whether we choose as a group to take all of a single assessment type or portions of others, I think the rapid focus of this one is quite useful. Any thoughts or comments?
Andy, it's Nick here. Is an assumption made with this approach that the data classification piece has already taken place before the meeting?
That's a great question to get the answer to the data sensitivity. If we go down to the guided process before the meeting, so they're asking for the data flow diagram, which is also a part of the kind of stride mechanism we'll look at afterwards. It doesn't specifically state as a precursor. Yeah, so the data dictionary portion, 5 to 10 minutes, concludes with, when you figure out what the bulk or the most important data is, set this as the service data classification in the metadata. So I think the answer to your question is it would really help to have a detailed view of that beforehand, because 10 minutes is not enough time to discuss a single.
Yeah, I would agree that there certainly needs to be a piece of work before the meeting to gather that information, and the short time frame here doesn't necessarily reflect the reality.
I think one of the other challenges with the kind of classic threat modeling, and where we're doing something like the tag security we do, for example, say we're doing Cert Manager, we don't know the data. We know generically what type of data, but we don't know the impact of data loss because it depends on the customer. You know, if the NSA are using Cert Manager, then it's much, much worse than a plumbing store is using Cert Manager. So it's a challenge with any threat of the kind of traditional threat modeling that are kind of be done by a company who are looking at a system which processes their data. They can say, okay, I know what the data value is because it's my company. Where you're just doing it in the abstract, which is kind of what tag security does, we have no idea. And so either we can kind of assume. So I think it's a generic, it's not just a problem for this one, but anyone that kind of talks a lot about data and its classification is a bit of a tricky one.
That's a great point, because I have a default bias to more regulated systems, which maybe isn't helpful to move something along in a lightweight fashion?
Yeah, I guess regulation and then contrasting that to the kind of open source projects that aren't perhaps as used to the kind of things that a regulated system would be very used to doing is a tricky one too. There's another, and I was going to throw this as a chat. It's something you want to read. There's another one which I've used before, which is super simple, which is just basically as a kind of developer threat modeling tool or approach, which is basically very simply summarized as what are you building, what can go wrong, what are you going to do. But that's, I just think in general, we want to, when we're picking a threat modeling, we need to pick one that's going to work for A, open source developers, and B, places where we have no idea what data is going to be specifically processed, which might be tricky otherwise.
Yeah, that's a great point. Playing it, I guess the risk score of something happening will be consistent, but the impact score, reputational, financial damage, or those kind of things is really variable. My instinct is to immediately consider putting a sort of numeric modifier on the thing for the, but that's not lightweight. There's immediate complexity in there for the usage.
Yeah, I think that is. I think the other challenge I've seen sometimes when doing threat modeling is that it's very easy to get embedded into a load of buzzwords that make sense to people who do threat modeling and don't make sense. They're not words that are intuitive to people who are just like not in the threat modeling world. And that's why I think any methodology, the ones that take away as many buzzwords as possible, I always find to be more approachable because everyone knows what does your software do. If you start talking about integrity and confidentiality, CIA triad, makes sense to security people. We're used to CIA triad. Talk to a developer about that, and those words might mean different things. So again, if we can, as few buzzwords as possible is good.
Yeah, another good point. I wonder if it's almost like test approaches. People consider unit tests quite standard, but integration tests could be integration sort of object-oriented class level, or integration of components, or integration of containers, or system integration between two larger things. I wonder if we consider building a lexicon as part of the thing as well. Although maybe I just don't want to let go of CIA. Okay.
Yeah, we might not need to let go of it so much as just when we're describing it, don't necessarily, or if we're going to use those terms, don't assume that people know those terms. And I'm not even sure that every security person thinks the same way about them, but don't assume people don't know those terms. And if we don't think they want to describe those terms, come up with a way of describing it that doesn't necessarily fall back to that. I mean, it might ultimately underlying it's going to be confidentiality and integrity, but you know, we can I think there's a risk of buzzwords.
Yeah, I've noted that as risk of jargon, perhaps establish a lexicon. I'm making some general questions in the notes at the bottom here. Okay, awesome. So the next one is stride, which actually crosses over slightly into some of the Martin Fowler bits there. If you don't mind navigating backwards and forwards, please, Brandon.
On which part?
It is back on the issue. Here we go. I'll drop it into here.
What, the stride?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Sorry, that was an easy way of describing it. So the stride methodology is, it came out of Microsoft in 2006 at the top, which is useful because I was going to guess before that. But again, it's slightly more application focused, but it does cover something like what the Martin Fowler article Rory was referring to talks about. It's called stride specifically because it takes a potential problem like communication between two entities, let's call them at this point maybe application points. Maybe one is just for the sake of risking stream of consciousness, but perhaps one is cert manager and the other is the Acme protocol endpoint for let's encrypt. And it says, okay, so for communication between those two pieces, what could happen? And you say, oh, maybe the link could be down, And then what's remediation? Well, we're regenerating those certificates at half the lifetime, so we've got at least 15 days or so to get the thing back. Okay, great. So that's one problem. We can't think of any more. Now let's go and stride it. So we take stride and we have spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. And this is in figure 3. So we've got the threats and the security property that it relates to. So then we would say, all right, between these two endpoints, how could we spoof the authentication between the two? Well, Let's Encrypt is based on email addresses. So if we have access or we can reroute that email, potentially we can do something there. I'm not familiar enough with the protocol to know actually particularly what we could do. We could potentially spoof the other endpoints. That would be breaking TLS. We assume that's quite low risk because as long as TLS 1.2, 1.3 sensible ciphers is used. But then maybe if it's TLS 1.0 or it's an SSL endpoint, we do have a risk there. And then we would say, okay, well, just make sure that lines up against our security controls and that we actually don't have low-grade encryption. We've got tampering, which perhaps again is breaking TLS, and we kind of wrap those two up together. I guess it could also be, yeah, I won't ideate too much further, but that's kind of the idea. We go through repudiation, information disclosure, what happens if the private keys are leaked, denial of service, what happens if someone black holes the root or takes down Let's Encrypt altogether. And these give us a list of things that we can then just say, well, all these are potential threats. That's how they relate to the system. The point about Stride, that's the core mechanism by which we can ideate these threats, but it has a stringent process. One is, as Roy mentioned, this concept of what are we building, what can go wrong, what are we going to do about it, and did we do a good job? And this is an acceptance that that threat modeling is inherently unbounded, and we could do this in perpetuity. So by putting a time box around it and saying, did we do a good job? We go back and we fix the most important things that we missed. That also gives us a sort of repetitive cadence to perform this on. The other point to make is that the what are we building stage crosses into what Nick mentioned. What's the data classification? What are our data flow diagrams? How is information flowing through the system? What does the system actually look like? To some extent, again, as Rory mentioned, this is in tag security what we have more difficulty with, because these are not our projects. These are projects generated by external and third parties. And so we would look to perhaps ensure that there's a sort of clearer definition of what those things are when they come into the tag. I'll move on unless anyone would like to throw anything else onto this one as well.
In my experience, there's a couple of things. If you go up to figure 5, you tend to create an extremely exhaustive list of threats, and it can get quite difficult to maintain over time because it takes a long time to produce. It ends up being difficult to maintain over time. I think if you apply some of the more, I think a lot of the threats that, I guess apply to data flows and so forth, you could try and create one for each of the types of threat in the Stride nomenclature. But at the same time, you could, within cloud, start applying zero trust principles and draw out the controls very quickly. So that then gets kind of tricky when you're, well, it just, modeling every single data flow can be a bit of a waste of time. And I guess this is, going back to Roy's point, this is probably one of the most sort of jargon-filled mechanisms. It's probably quite abstract for developers. And nobody when I've kind of interacted with these groups and tried to use an iteration of this sort of methodology, nobody can agree on what a trust boundary is. We end up spending so much time talking about what a trust boundary is rather than threat modeling the thing. So we get lost in process sometimes.
That's a superb point on trust boundaries. One of the definitions is it's anywhere that data steps up or down. But you can immediately see how that doesn't quite make sense. Another might be it's somewhere that you try and prevent an escalation from one point to another. So if something's a root-owned process spawning an unprivileged process, there's a trust boundary there between the unprivileged process and the root process. But of course, the root process doesn't trust the child, so they'd look slightly different from either side. Yes, the data flow diagram, purgatory. Any more on this one?
I'll just add that I find Stride to be very useful to ensure that you cover the key areas, but I don't get too hung up on articulating to the customer which area of Stride you associated with a particular vulnerability, etc. But very useful as an approach to ensure that you cover the different areas.
Just very briefly, just within the context of the ticket, I guess the threat modeling approach that is chosen kind of depends on what the true goal of the security review is. Is it to go into sort of minute depth and catch all the issues, or is it just to look for any sort of howlers or major issues at a slightly higher level? And that will probably the scope or the depth that you choose will probably affect which, how thorough and how long your threat model will take.
Agreed. I think it's at a high level to make sure there are no howlers. I think a low level assessment is an involved piece of work with a significant write-up, perhaps, that is beyond the realms of sort of working group efforts, maybe. Okay. Thank you very much. Let's jump into the Autodesk continuous threat modeling. I think we've only got 8 minutes, so I'll just whiz through this and then give us a chance to look at the trail of bits piece as well. I think maybe the guidelines are just enough to keep over the I have to admit, having not watched the video for this, so unless anybody can sort of volunteer at the high level, I think maybe we'll skip that one and I'll drop a note in afterwards. Okay, let's jump on to the trail of bits. So the interesting point about this, of course, is that this was used for the actual Kubernetes threat model itself. If we could just jump into the, maybe which one's least complicated.
Which link were you looking for over here?
Oh, sorry. So that's the penultimate link, from Logi Kill on the 22nd of June, please.
This one over here, or did I click to, didn't I?
Yes. So this is actually using a modified rapid risk assessment process. So the first thing we looked at from Mozilla was used for this assessment. And the notes here, we modified these to include the controls we had agreed upon with the Kubernetes audit team at the time, and it worked quite well. So I don't believe this individual is on the call, but I will ping this thread to notify people that we've got some notes and ask them for any further contributions. It's probably worth also moving this into a doc, which I'll do as well out of band. So if we go into the notes in the repo, and then which of you jumped into there, Brandon? We can choose.
I'd start in container runtime, but I can pick any of these.
That's where I started, but it's probably the most complex. Which is the least complex? Fine, let's do container runtime, just see. So the templates, sorry, I'm talking at cross purposes. Let's go into the template because that will give us the quickest way through this, I think. Perfect, thank you. So we can see here, we've got these kind of fundamental starters for 10 in each of the sections. How does the service work? Well, limiting the complexity of the answers allows these to be completed within a reasonable period of time, I think. Subcomponents or shared boundaries. That's interesting because it avoids the word trust, but it addresses the same kind of issue. Shared boundaries between components are anything with a security relation, anything that we wouldn't want to. Maybe it's a one-way diode that we don't want communication coming back through, for example. Maybe it's a sort of route to user-owned process. Maybe it's control of a network device, etc. What communications protocols does it use? This is interesting because we've got communications protocols, data, and sensitive data. And that is data just in at rest, rather, not specifically being stored. Worth noting, of course, that this was good enough for Kubernetes itself. So perhaps plays into some of these previous discussions that we've had. Then in the control families section, so looking at these 6 basic control families: networking, cryptography, secrets management, authentication, authorization, multi-tenancy, isolation. The latter one is, of course, a more complex orchestrator style distributed system concern. The rest of them are relatively standard. I wonder if there would be anything, again, it's probably not sensible for me to kind of stream of consciousness additional things in here. And then as we roll down, we've got the questions about the control families, but the threat scenarios. So the starting point of an attacker in the system. Let's imagine that there is a negative situation where an external attacker has not been able to gain access to the client application. So this is the web-facing presence. This is what we face the network with. It's probably open sockets. It could be a supply chain attack if we're able to infiltrate infrastructure from a different route. Could be, no, it's not a supply chain attack. Sorry, it's just without access. So it's the network-facing presentation of the application. The next threat scenario, valid access to the client application. So that's essentially an authenticated user. Could be a malicious insider. Then we've got an internal attacker with access to the cluster. So the assumption there is that we've had a remote code execution, or that potentially there's been a supply chain attack that's triggered some sort of remote command and control. Somehow we've gained an escalated access as an attacker. And then finally, a malicious internal user. This is an operator who, and I mean a human operator potentially, who is looking to escalate their privilege in some way. These are really useful. These are also what I use in penetration testing in order just to make sure that everything's covered. I think that almost takes us to the end of the time. We've got a couple of minutes. Anybody with any thoughts around this template, which I think is a very useful start?
Yeah, I like this template, at least in order to really get me like dug into the inception of what we're trying to accomplish and give me something tangible. I'm gonna, I'm gonna say that I'm still pretty new to some of these, like to some of the frameworks, and so understanding like what's going to be relevant and then how is it relevant, given the nature of what may come across tag security for threat modeling is kind of interesting space.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree. I think it's yeah, useful and simple. Any other thoughts around this or any of the former before we wrap up?
Just very quickly, there was the control section. So the controls, or the control families that were selected, they were selected within the scope of the audit. I guess just at high level, if we were to sort of almost copy paste this and use this for our own security reviews, like would we start overlapping with some of the audit streams of work that are going on, and how do we make sure both provide value without duplicating the work?
Yeah, I agree. I think the I think just from running through these briefly, I feel like the simplicity of a template like this is a great starting point to get things done fairly quickly, along with perhaps a little bit more front loading, because for Kubernetes, of course, that is one monolith. I say monolithic in the politest possible sense, but a monolithic application that security appraisers have a holistic view over the whole piece. Whereas with smaller components like Cert Manager, Flux, perhaps, we are looking at a lot of prior knowledge to be provided to us by the maintainers. So I'll write up these notes. I think I really appreciate the questions that we've had today, especially around making sure that this is approachable and non-jargon filled. I'll write this up into a doc, put it onto the issue, and perhaps suggest building out a template with elements of maybe Stride, more of the rapid risk assessment, a look at Autodesk, and there is one further suggestion on the issue that we didn't get a chance to look at that I'll just link to as well. That concludes our first EMEA flavored tag security. Thank you very much for everyone who attended, especially representatives from the other side of the pond who are probably at some ungodly hour in their time zone. Much appreciated. And as I say, any feedback welcome, either in person or on the Slack channel or the mailing list. Thank you for your attendance and have a lovely day.